There is a specific kind of silence that surrounds certain American cities. Not the silence of neglect, not the silence of poverty, but the deliberate silence of people who understood, at some foundational level, that asking certain questions would cost them more than the answer was worth. Atlantic City was surrounded by that kind of silence for nearly a century. And what makes that silence worth examining is not the corruption itself. Many cities have been corrupted. What makes Atlantic City different is the architecture. The way the corruption was not introduced into an existing system, but was built into the system from the very beginning, woven into the city's economic logic, its political structure, and its cultural identity before most of the buildings on the boardwalk had even been constructed. This is not a story about one man who broke the rules. This is a story about a city where the rules were designed to be broken, and where that design served a function, generated a profit, and was protected by institutions at every level for nearly 100 years. To understand what happened in Atlantic City, you have to understand what Atlantic City was built to be. In 1854, a group of investors and a railroad developer named Richard Osborne created a resort on Absecon Island, a barrier strip of sand off the southern coast of New Jersey. The city was conceived not as a community, but as a product, a destination designed to extract money from visitors arriving by train from Philadelphia and New York. The logic was simple and it was structural. Atlantic City existed to give people what they wanted, and what many visitors wanted, particularly in an era of strict Sunday blue laws and social restriction, was access to things they could not easily obtain at home: alcohol on Sundays, gambling, prostitution. This was not a secret. City leaders understood it. Resort operators understood it. The local government understood it. What emerged in the earliest years of Atlantic City's existence was a formal, if unwritten, arrangement. The vice industry would be permitted to operate. In exchange, operators would pay protection money to whoever controlled the city's political apparatus. The money would flow upward. The services would flow outward to tourists, and the city would maintain the appearance of a respectable resort while functioning, in practice, as one of the most openly corrupt municipalities in the northeastern United States. This arrangement was not an aberration, it was the business model. The first man to codify it into something resembling a governing structure was a businessman and political operator named Louis Keenley, known around the city as the Commodore. In the years before and after the turn of the 20th century, Keenley controlled Atlantic City's Republican machine with a thoroughness that left almost no element of civic life untouched. According to historical accounts of the period, every candidate for public office, every city contract, and every commercial license required his approval. This was not merely corruption, this was governance by another name. Quainel did not need to hold elected office. He held something more durable, the machinery that determined who held office. And as long as the resort economy depended on vice, and vice depended on protection, and protection depended on political control, Keenley's position was structurally secure. What disrupted him was not a reform movement from within. It was a reforming governor from outside, a man named Woodrow Wilson, who in 1910 led an investigation into election fraud in Atlantic City that resulted in indictments of more than 100 people, including Keenley himself and a young county official named Enoch Lewis Johnson. Quainel was convicted and sent to prison for a year. Johnson was acquitted. That distinction would define the next 3 decades of Atlantic City's history. Enoch Johnson was the son of the Atlantic County Sheriff, a man whose family had been embedded in the county's political apparatus for decades. He had grown up understanding power not as something to be seized, but as something to be inherited, maintained, and carefully expanded. He had watched the machine operate since childhood. He understood its mechanics. And when Keenley left for prison in 1913, Johnson assumed control of what Keenley had built and began to improve it. He was 30 years old. Over the next 2 decades, Johnson would transform the Atlantic City machine into one of the most sophisticated instruments of political control in American history, not through exceptional cruelty, not through theatrical violence, but through a disciplined understanding of how power actually functions in a democratic system. He never ran for elected office. He never needed to. Instead, he accumulated appointed positions that gave him access to the city's finances and the county's patronage network. He became Atlantic County Treasurer in 1914, a position he would hold for nearly 3 decades. He controlled the county tax apparatus. He served as a bank director, a building and loan president, and a newspaper publisher. Each position was a node in a network. Together, they constituted something close to a parallel government, one that operated alongside the official institutions of Atlantic City and Atlantic County, and that was, in most practical respects, more powerful than any of them. The financial architecture of Johnson's machine rested on a single structural principle. Every business that operated in the vice economy paid a percentage of its revenues to the organization. According to historical records and later federal investigations, every gambling den operator, every brothel madam, every numbers runner in Atlantic City paid into a system that Johnson controlled from the 9th floor of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Federal investigators later estimated Johnson's annual income at approximately $500,000 during the height of his power. That figure represented not a salary, not the proceeds of a single enterprise, but something closer to a tax, a systematic extraction from an entire economic sector that operated in plain sight, under the protection of the political apparatus Johnson controlled. At the time, none of this seemed extraordinary to the people of Atlantic City. What made the machine durable was not fear. Johnson was not primarily a violent man. Investigators and biographers have noted with some consistency that he was not suspected of ordering killings, and that accounts describing him personally suggest a man who understood that violence was inefficient, that it attracted attention, created enemies, and generated the kind of instability that was bad for business. Johnson ruled, as multiple contemporary accounts described it, with a velvet hammer. What that phrase meant in practice was a combination of extraordinary generosity and absolute control. Johnson was known throughout the city as a man who would listen to problems and solve them. Jobs for constituents, contracts for businesses, leniency for minor offenders. He dispensed favors from the Ritz-Carlton with a consistency and scale that created a network of obligations so deep and so wide that opposition became nearly impossible to organize. If you worked in Atlantic City, you likely owed your job to someone who owed their job to someone who owed a favor to Nucky Johnson. That was not metaphor. That was the organizational chart of municipal government. The arrival of Prohibition in 1920 did not challenge this structure, it expanded it. Atlantic City in the 1920s became, in effect, a free port, while cities across the country attempted to enforce the Volstead Act with varying degrees of seriousness. Atlantic City made a policy decision never formally stated, but operationally clear to ignore federal prohibition entirely. Alcohol was available in the open. Enforcement was non-existent. Johnson saw in Prohibition not a legal complication, but an economic opportunity of historic scale. Atlantic City became one of the primary eastern ports for illegal alcohol importation. Ships moved cargo to the New Jersey coast. Local distribution networks, operating under the protection of a police force whose leadership answered to the machine, moved product into speakeasies and clubs across the city and into the broader northeastern supply chain. The scale of the operation brought Johnson into contact with organized crime figures from across the country, men who would themselves go on to constitute the founding infrastructure of what would later be called the National Crime Syndicate: Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Arnold Rothstein, Johnny Torrio. These were not social acquaintances, they were business relationships, managed by a political boss who understood that the value of Atlantic City to the national criminal economy depended entirely on his ability to maintain stable political control locally. In May of 1929, Johnson hosted what has since become known as the Atlantic City Conference, a gathering of crime bosses from across the country, held at the Ritz-Carlton and the Ambassador Hotel on the boardwalk. Attendees included Al Capone, Bugs Moran, and figures from criminal organizations operating in every major American city. The conference has been described in historical accounts as an early attempt to rationalize the criminal economy, to establish territorial agreements, settle disputes, and lay the groundwork for coordinated national operations. Seen in isolation, the conference might appear to be a criminal event that happened to take place in Atlantic City. Seen in structural terms, it was something else. It was a demonstration of what political stability at the local level made possible at the national level. Atlantic City was valuable to the criminal economy of the 1920s, not primarily because of its own vice industry, but because it was one of the few places in America where a meeting of this kind could be held without disruption. That was Johnson's product, not alcohol, not gambling, not prostitution. Political stability, purchased and maintained through the systematic corruption of every institution that was supposed to constrain it. The photographs from that week survive. Johnson walking the boardwalk in his tailored suit, red carnation in the lapel, flanked by Capone and other men whose names federal investigators had been compiling for years. The photographs were not taken in secret. They appeared in newspapers. They were not hidden because they did not need to be hidden. That is the detail that stops you, if you think about it carefully. Not that the meeting happened, not that these men were in the same place, but that the documentation of it was public, and nothing followed. The machine that controlled Atlantic City controlled what happened to that documentation. A photograph of the country's most powerful crime bosses walking the boardwalk with the city's political boss appeared in print, and the appropriate authority, the police, the prosecutor, the state government did not respond in any meaningful way, because the appropriate authority was part of the picture. Before examining how the machine ended, it is worth pausing on what it looked like at its height. On a Sunday afternoon in Atlantic City during the late 1920s, a visitor stepping off the train at the Pennsylvania Railroad terminus would have encountered something that existed nowhere else on the East Coast. Bars open in violation of the state's Sunday closing laws. Gambling rooms operating without concealment on streets a short walk from the boardwalk hotels, police officers who saw none of it, not because they were incompetent, because they were paid not to see it. The machine's genius was precisely this visibility. The corruption was not hidden. It operated in the open, which meant it operated with a kind of legitimacy that secrecy could never have provided. Everyone could see that the law did not apply in Atlantic City. That was the product. That was what tourists paid to experience. And the money that tourists spent on that experience, on the gambling, on the alcohol, on the other services available in a city that had suspended normal legal constraints, flowed upward through a system so embedded in the city's daily life that distinguishing between the economy and the corruption had become effectively impossible. By the early 1930s, the pressures on the machine were becoming visible. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 eliminated a major revenue stream and removed one of Atlantic City's primary competitive advantages as a tourist destination. Investigative reporters, particularly those writing for William Randolph Hearst's newspaper network, had begun publishing detailed accounts of Johnson's operations. A federal investigation into his taxes was initiated. The investigation was methodical and slow. It did not proceed by building a case around the vice economy itself, because doing so would have required proving what everyone in Atlantic City already knew and what no witness inside the machine was likely to testify to. Instead, federal prosecutors took the same approach that had been used against Al Capone: income tax evasion. In May of 1939, Johnson was indicted for evading taxes on approximately $125,000 in income received from numbers operators in 1935 and 1936. After 3 federal trials, he was convicted in July of 1941 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. He entered Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in August of 1941. Atlantic City did not collapse. It adapted. Consider what that means. A man had just been convicted of running, for 3 decades, what federal prosecutors described as a systematic criminal enterprise spanning every aspect of the city's political and economic life. He had extracted money from every illegal operation in Atlantic City. He had corrupted the police, the courts, and the county government. He had used that corruption to extend his reach into the New Jersey state legislature, the governor's office, and the national structure of organized crime. He went to prison, and within months, the machine he had built was operating under new management. The same patronage networks, the same protection structure, the same underpaid police supplementing their incomes through the same tolerance payments, the same gambling operations, the same brothels, the same numbers runners paying into the same system. Federal prosecutors had spent years building the case against Johnson. They had secured their conviction. And the system that produced him continued without interruption. That outcome was not a failure of the prosecution. The prosecution succeeded. It was a revelation about the nature of what had been prosecuted. The machine was not Nucky Johnson. Nucky Johnson was one instance of the machine. The transition of power from Enoch Johnson to Frank Farley is one of the most instructive episodes in the political history of Atlantic City, precisely because of what it reveals about the relationship between corruption and institutional legitimacy. Johnson had been, in the clearest sense, a crime boss who also controlled politics. His power derived primarily from his position inside the criminal economy, and his political control was the mechanism that protected and sustained that economy. Farley was different. He was a lawyer and a state senator, a product of Georgetown University Law Center, a man who, by almost every public account, understood that the most durable form of political control was not the kind that operated in the shadows. It was the kind that operated in the open, wearing the full authority of elected office. His first significant act after assuming leadership of the Atlantic City machine in 1941 was to separate the political apparatus from the criminal one. He appointed Jimmy Boyd, who had been Johnson's enforcer and the overseer of the city's organized crime operations, to manage the criminal side of the organization. Farley himself would focus on the legislature. This was not a reform. It was a reorganization. What that reorganization looked like on the ground was this. In the neighborhoods around the boardwalk, the numbers operations continued. Small-scale gambling on 3-digit daily draws $1 here. 50 cents there ran through the same network of neighborhood operators and collection men it always had. A percentage of each day's take moved upward through the same channels it had moved through under Johnson. The money eventually reached the same political apparatus. The apparatus continued to fund the same patronage network. The only thing that had changed was the name at the top of the organizational chart, and the formal distance between that name and the criminal revenue it depended on. What Farley understood and what made him, in the judgment of most historians who have examined the period, the more formidable figure was that political power exercised through legitimate institutions is almost impossible to challenge. Johnson could be indicted for tax evasion because his criminal activities generated income that could be traced. Farley's power flowed through committee chairmanships, budget allocations, patronage appointments, and legislative relationships that were entirely legal in form, even when they served corrupt ends. For 34 years, Frank Farley served as the state senator from Atlantic County. He became Senate Majority Leader in 1944. He served as Senate President. At various points, he served as acting governor of New Jersey. He chaired, at one time or another, all of the major committees of the New Jersey Senate. He was, in the assessment of historians who have examined this period, the last successful political boss New Jersey ever produced. That assessment is worth dwelling on, not because it is praise. It is not intended as praise, but because it identifies something structurally significant. Farley was successful not despite operating in a democratic system, but because he understood that system more completely than his opponents. He understood that a senator who controls committee assignments controls legislation, that a party boss who controls the county chairman controls the nomination process, that in an era when the New Jersey Senate gave every county a single senator regardless of population, a senator from a small county like Atlantic could wield the same formal power as a senator from Essex County with 8 times the population. He exploited these structural features with precision and without sentimentality. The deliverables were real: the Garden State Parkway, the Atlantic City Expressway, the Atlantic City Racecourse, Stockton State College, a state marina, a ferry service, community colleges across South Jersey. These were not incidental. They were the machine's justification for itself, the evidence that could be pointed to when critics raised questions about corruption, and the infrastructure of obligation that tied the region's economic development to Farley's continued political dominance. In the background, the criminal operations continued. According to accounts compiled by the Kefauver Committee, a Senate investigation into organized crime that held televised hearings in 1951 Atlantic City remained one of the most active centers of illegal gambling in the northeastern United States. Bookmakers and numbers operators did business in the millions of dollars annually. The police, as multiple sources including the Kefauver testimony indicated, were underpaid by design and supplemented their incomes through the tolerance of illegal operations. The Kefauver Committee exposed what it found. It named names. It described operations. It produced a public record. Nothing structural changed. Farley was never indicted. He was questioned. He was investigated. Shadow after shadow was cast in his direction by investigators, by journalists, and by a group of 4 Atlantic City police officers known as the Four Horsemen, who conducted unauthorized raids on illegal gambling operations and attempted to document connections between the vice economy and city leadership. The Four Horsemen, Jack Portock, William Shepperson, Francis Gribben, and Fred Warlich, operated outside the official chain of command because the official chain of command was part of the problem they were trying to document. They gathered evidence. They submitted reports. According to accounts of the period, their efforts were systematically ignored by city and county leadership, and their careers suffered professionally for their persistence. To understand what that meant in practice, consider the position these 4 men occupied. They were police officers in a department where their colleagues' mortgages depended on the tolerance money that flowed from illegal gambling operations. They were gathering evidence against a machine that controlled the appointment of the police chief who supervised them. They were filing reports with city leadership that was, in important respects, the subject of those reports. Their evidence did not disappear because it was hidden. It disappeared because the institutions designed to receive it and act on it were the same institutions the evidence implicated. There was no safe channel. There was no authority above the machine within the city. Federal investigators were at a distance. State investigators operated in a political environment that Farley had shaped for 2 decades. The press operated in a city where the consequences of aggressive reporting on the machine were professionally understood. The Four Horsemen were not defeated by any single decision made by any single person. They were defeated by an architecture, a structure that ensured, without anyone needing to give a specific order, that their evidence would go nowhere. One of them, Fred Warlich, continued pushing against the system into the 1960s. What he received, by most accounts, was not prosecution of the people he had documented. It was continued marginalization within a department that had no incentive to act on what he knew. Seen in isolation, each instance of suppression might appear to be an individual decision. Seen in sequence, the pattern is something else. This is what distinguishes institutional corruption from individual corruption. Individual corruption can be prosecuted. It depends on specific people making specific decisions for personal gain. When those people are removed, the system can potentially be reformed. Institutional corruption is different. It persists because the system itself is structured to resist correction. The people who could investigate it depend on it for their positions. The people who could prosecute it operate within a jurisdiction that the machine controls. The people who could publicize it face professional consequences that outweigh the benefit of doing so. The Four Horsemen were a small group of low-ranking police officers trying to document a problem that extended from the precincts they worked in to the office of the most powerful legislator in New Jersey state history. They were not equipped for that fight, and the system was not designed to help them win it. By the late 1960s, the forces that would ultimately end Farley's machine were assembling, not from within Atlantic City, but from outside it. The physical city was deteriorating. Atlantic City had peaked as a resort destination in the years after World War II and had been declining since. The rise of commercial aviation made Florida and the Caribbean accessible to the middle-class tourists who had historically fueled the boardwalk economy. The highway system that Farley had helped build made it easier for New Jersey residents to drive past Atlantic City to other destinations. Urban renewal projects in the late 1950s and 1960s displaced established communities without replacing the economic activity they had generated. By 1970, Atlantic City was a city in physical and economic decline, governed by a political machine that had been in continuous operation for roughly 80 years. The hotels on the boardwalk were aging, unemployment was high, poverty was concentrated and visible. The machine that had sustained itself partly by delivering economic development to the region was now presiding over an economy in visible decline, and the connection between Farley's political dominance and the city's deteriorating condition was becoming harder for the electorate to ignore. In November of 1971, Frank Farley lost his state Senate seat to a Democratic physician named Joseph McGann. The margin was not close. Farley had served 34 years. He was 70 years old. He accepted the outcome, according to reports at the time, without public bitterness. He died in September of 1977, 5 years before the consequences of his final political act became fully visible. That act was a vote. A failed one. In his final term, Farley had attempted to introduce legislation that would authorize a referendum on the legalization of casino gambling in Atlantic City. He understood, according to those who worked with him, that the city's economic decline was structural and that the resort model, which had sustained Atlantic City since 1854, was no longer viable. Casino gambling represented the most obvious alternative. The legislation failed. Farley's opponents were numerous, and his political influence, while still considerable, was diminished. He was also, according to historical accounts, cautious about publicly associating himself with the proposal, aware that his name on casino legislation would carry the weight of every corruption investigation that had ever touched him. The legislation he could not pass was passed 4 years later. In November of 1976, New Jersey voters approved the legalization of casino gambling, not statewide, but in Atlantic City specifically, as what the referendum described as a unique tool of urban redevelopment. The vote was narrow, 56% in favor. Governor Brendan Byrne signed the Casino Control Act in 1977 and directed a message at organized crime that has since become one of the most quoted phrases in the political history of New Jersey. He told organized crime, publicly, to keep its hands off Atlantic City's casinos. The regulatory structure that accompanied legalization was, by the standards of the time, unusually rigorous. New Jersey created 2 separate oversight agencies, the Casino Control Commission and the Division of Gaming Enforcement, operating independently of each other, with broad licensing authority and the explicit mandate to prevent organized crime infiltration. The licensing requirements extended not only to casino operators, but to their officers, directors, investors, and business partners. Union locals seeking to represent casino workers were subjected to scrutiny. Vendors doing business with casinos were investigated. The intent was serious. The structure was serious. And yet, a 4-month investigation conducted by the New York Times shortly after casinos opened documented that members and associates of at least 4 organized crime groups had attempted to capitalize on the casino gambling expansion. According to that reporting, their efforts extended to real estate, restaurants, hospitality businesses, croupier training schools, and the union locals that would represent tens of thousands of casino workers. A journalist and organized crime expert named Hank Messick, who had spent years documenting the relationship between the mob and American gambling interests, told the Washington Post in the days before the first Atlantic City casino opened that legalization did not represent a defeat for organized crime, that regardless of who opened the doors, organized crime would find ways to be present. The regulatory agencies worked, for the most part, in the specific domain of casino licensing. New Jersey's enforcement record in the subsequent decades was more effective than many observers had expected. Several major companies were denied licenses or forced to divest. the direct infiltration of casino management that characterized the Las Vegas model of the 1950s and 1960s was largely prevented. But the question that the regulatory success tends to obscure is a structural one. The machine had been removed, the dependency had not. Atlantic City in 1977 had not resolved the conditions that made 80 years of machine politics possible. It had changed the economic form of those conditions. A city built to extract money from visitors, controlled by whoever held the key to that extraction, had simply found a new form of the key. Atlantic City in 1977 had been governed, with almost no interruption, by a corrupt political machine for roughly 80 years. The machine had selected its police chiefs, its mayors, its county officials, its judges. It had determined which businesses succeeded and which failed. It had controlled the information that the press reported and the investigations that law enforcement pursued. It had built a culture of deference to power that was not simply the product of individual corruption, but of generational normalization. That culture did not disappear because a referendum passed and a governor signed a bill. What changed was the form of the capture. The machine that had controlled Atlantic City through vice protection and patronage politics was replaced, over time, by a different set of economic actors: casino corporations, developers, union interests, each of which had its own relationship with the city's political structure. The organized crime that had operated through Johnson's protection network was, over time, displaced by corporate ownership. But corporate ownership brought its own forms of influence over local government through campaign contributions, development agreements, regulatory lobbying, and the kind of economic dependency that comes when a city's tax base is heavily concentrated in a small number of large employers. The structural problem was not the mob. The mob was a symptom. The structural problem was that Atlantic City had been built around an economic model that concentrated power in the hands of whoever controlled access to the entertainment economy. And that concentration of power, whether it was held by Keenly, by Johnson, by Farley, by casino corporations, or by a combination of private and public interests, consistently outran the capacity of democratic institutions to constrain it. Atlantic City's reform movements understood this imperfectly, if at all. The Kefauver hearings of 1951 exposed criminal activity without changing the conditions that generated it. The investigations of the 1960s that contributed to Farley's eventual electoral defeat focused on corruption as a feature of specific individuals rather than as a feature of the city's political economy. The casino referendum of 1976 was sold to the public as a solution to economic decline, not as a reckoning with the governance failures that had allowed the decline to occur. In each case, the reform that was available was a partial one that addressed the visible surface of a problem without engaging the structural depth beneath it. The Four Horsemen, the four police officers who spent years trying to document connections between city government and organized crime, were eventually removed from their unofficial investigative role. Their evidence was never systematically acted upon by authorities with the power to use it. Their careers did not advance. The investigation they had been conducting independently was not absorbed into any official process. This outcome was not exceptional. It was the predictable product of a system in which the institutions nominally responsible for accountability law enforcement, the judiciary, the press, elected government were each implicated, in varying degrees, in the structure they would have been required to investigate. The Atlantic City press operated for decades in a climate that did not encourage aggressive investigation of the machine. The city's police department was structurally dependent on the same political apparatus it would have needed to challenge: the New Jersey state government, in which Farley exercised extraordinary influence for 3 decades, was not an independent check on Atlantic City's political machine. It was, in important respects, an extension of it. The failure was not a failure of courage in any individual. It was a failure of institutional design, the absence of any mechanism that could have applied meaningful accountability from outside the system. The closest thing to an external check was federal prosecution, and federal prosecution, as the career of Nucky Johnson demonstrated, was available, But it was slow, resource-intensive, applied selectively, and addressed individuals rather than systems. When Johnson went to prison, the machine did not end. It reorganized. And Farley, who was more careful about managing public appearances than Johnson had been, operated for another 30 years. The deeper question, the one that the Atlantic City case poses with particular force, is whether democratic institutions can effectively constrain power structures that are embedded in the economic foundation of the communities those institutions are supposed to govern. Atlantic City's answer, over nearly a century, was largely negative. The machine survived because it delivered things that the community genuinely needed and wanted: jobs, infrastructure, services, entertainment, and because challenging it carried real costs for the individuals positioned to do so. The four horsemen who tried to document corruption were not lacking in determination. They were four police officers trying to take on a structure that extended from the precinct level to the governor's office, without institutional support, without legal protection, and without any guarantee that the evidence they were gathering would ever reach a forum capable of acting on it. That is not a failure of individuals. It is a failure of architecture. When the machine finally ended, not through prosecution, not through sustained reform, but through electoral defeat in 1971, the conditions that had produced it did not end. The city's economic decline continued. Poverty deepened. The physical infrastructure of the resort deteriorated. The casino referendum of 1976 was, in this context, not a fresh start, but a wager. A bet that a new economic model could succeed where the old one had failed, without addressing the governance failures that had allowed the old one to operate for so long. Whether that bet succeeded depends on what question you are asking. If the question is whether organized crime was successfully excluded from the casino industry, the answer, based on available evidence, is largely yes, with significant qualifications. If the question is whether the legalization of casino gambling achieved the urban redevelopment it promised, the answer is more complicated. Atlantic City's casino revenues were substantial in the early years. The hotels were built. The jobs were created. For a period, the experiment appeared to be working. But the prosperity of the casino corridor did not extend into the surrounding neighborhoods. By most measures of urban welfare housing quality, educational outcomes, poverty rates, life expectancy, Atlantic City by the early 21st century remained a deeply distressed city. The concentration of economic activity in the casino industry created a new form of dependency, one in which the city's tax base was almost entirely hostage to the fortunes of a single industry that was itself subject to competition from casinos in neighboring states. By 2014, 5 of Atlantic City's 12 casinos had filed for bankruptcy or announced closures. The city that had been built as a product in 1854, designed to extract money from visitors, found itself, 160 years later, in essentially the same structural position it had always occupied, dependent on outside capital, vulnerable to market forces it could not control, governed by institutions whose capacity for independent action had been shaped by a century of subordination to whatever economic power happened to be dominant at the time. There is a phrase used by a sociologist who contributed to a retrospective account of the city's political history that captures something important about this dynamic. He observed that Atlantic City had grown up as an independent entity without a strong state to countermand it, and that in such conditions, the development of local fiefdoms was a natural outcome. That observation is worth taking seriously. Atlantic City's corruption was not a deviant feature of an otherwise healthy system. It was the product of structural conditions, geographic, economic, and political, that made the concentration of power in private hands both possible and, in certain important respects, functional. The machine delivered things. It maintained order of a particular kind. It suppressed certain forms of violence while enabling others. It extracted from the economy, but also invested in it. This is what makes the Atlantic City case difficult to reduce to a simple moral narrative. The men who ran the machine were not ideologues. They were not, for the most part, especially cruel. They were operators, Men who understood power as a tool and used it with a level of sophistication that their critics and successors rarely matched. Nucky Johnson spent 30 years managing one of the most complex political and criminal enterprises in American history without ever being convicted of anything other than tax evasion. Farley spent 34 years as one of the most powerful legislators in New Jersey history and was never indicted at all. Their success was not evidence of their virtue. It was evidence of the depth of the structural protections available to people who controlled the machinery of government. And the lesson that emerges from examining that success is not a lesson about exceptional individuals. It is a lesson about what ordinary institutions do and fail to do when the interests of accountability come into conflict with the interests of the people those institutions are supposed to serve. Atlantic City in 2018 saw the FBI raid the home of its sitting mayor on allegations of fraud. He had been in office for less than a year. The form of the corruption had changed. The positions had changed. The names had changed. The underlying structure, the concentration of power in whoever controlled access to the city's economic life, the subordination of democratic accountability to private interests, the persistence of arrangements that benefited insiders at the expense of the public had not disappeared. A city does not generate that kind of continuity by accident. It generates it through architecture, through the accumulated weight of decisions made, institutions shaped, and alternatives foreclosed over the course of a century. The machine that Nucky Johnson inherited from Lewis Keenel in 1913 has not survived in any recognizable form. The men who ran it are dead. The industries that financed it have largely moved on. The resort economy of the boardwalk era is a subject for historians rather than a functioning model of urban development. But the conditions that made the machine possible, the concentration of economic power in a geographically isolated resort city, the structural weakness of democratic institutions in the face of that concentration, the cultural normalization of arrangements that would elsewhere be recognized as corruption, those conditions are not unique to Atlantic City. And they were not eliminated by anything that happened in the 100 years under examination here. The Four Horsemen submitted their reports. The Kefauver Committee held its hearings. The newspapers published their investigations. The federal prosecutors built their cases. And the machine ran, without fundamental interruption, for 90 years. The silence that surrounded Atlantic City was not the silence of ignorance. The corruption was not a secret. The names were known. The mechanisms were documented. The connections between the political machine and the criminal economy were described in public record after public record. It was the silence of a system designed, from the beginning, to make accountability more expensive than accommodation. That choice and the architecture that made it rational outlasted every individual who enforced it. It always does.